in terms of my presentation. There's going to be a lot of information, but you'll be able to get the slides from Laura, and you can take a look at them, anytime. They're yours. Use them now, use them in the future. A little bit of background about me. I am the founder and partner of Change Ventures, a venture capital fund established first in the United States, Change Ventures One, and then the second fund in Europe, in Estonia, a 50 million fund that invested into startups from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, but doing business all over the world. Together, I guess, with my angel investments, I've done over 40 investments. The startups have gone on to raise over 400 million euros and have created over 3,500 jobs. We have one unicorn so far, but a couple of other pretty successful startups, and looking forward to exits that are very good for the local founders here. So I was asked to talk about basically what data we look at as investors, and therefore the startups that want to raise money, what data and metrics they should be following, because these are the questions I will ask. Now, I for some reason I cannot share the slides, so if you could, Laura, maybe share the slides.
Just a second.
Yeah, great. Okay, so as Laura said, this is basically part two. We started in Nairobi. I'm going to do a quick catch up, a mini review of what we talked about there, and then get into the part two, which is really getting a little bit deeper down into the metrics that we look at, and a little more detailed information that we usually will analyze for every startup before investing. Because the bottom line is, I am investing other people's money. I'm a professional investor. While angels can put their money wherever they want, as a professional investor, I am responsible to the people that gave me the money, pension funds, everything else. And for that, I need to have an understanding of what is it that the startup that is asking for money, what are they doing? Because we'd like to see that money back, right? Because we have to return it to the insurance companies, pension funds, our investors, etc. So used to be that everybody did a business plan. It was this 30, 40 pages typed, this big book almost on what you're doing. The reality is that for startups, things are changing quite quickly. And really, in order to facilitate the speed with which things move, a business model is more what we look at nowadays. And really, this is good for you. You should be doing this on your own yourself as a startup. But for us, it is vital. So if you want investor money, if you're looking for investor money, then you absolutely have to have a good representation of your business model. I am trying to go forward in these slides, but okay. So it seems like it's going with delay, or maybe Laura, you're clicking, but it's slowly moving forward. So just like with every professional activity, you really need to have a plan. I mean, you can't just start building and hope that the house will come out okay. Architects need a building plan. Every business, even professional sports, needs a business plan, essentially of how they're going to play, what players are going to be on the field, how this will work out, because just trying things out is way too expensive. And especially, again, if you want investor money, we need to know ahead of time if it even makes sense for us to invest in this kind of a business. So for that, generally, I have been using the business model canvas, which is Osterwalder. It came from the book Business Model Generation by Osterwalder. And in there, he presents this business model canvas. a simplified, standardized way of explaining what's the game plan, what are we going to do. There's specific boxes, like the customer, the value proposition, costs, expenses, etc. And if we use this kind of a model, then everybody, both sides of the table, understands what we're talking about. And it doesn't matter if you're more of a developer, more of a salesperson, more of a techie. If we're all using the same boxes, if we're using the same symbols, then we can play the same game. And for that, I really recommend business model generation is already 10 years old, more. It's 15 years old at least, but it's withstood the test of time. So in the first investor meeting, I often even print this out. And when I'm sitting down in the first investor meeting, I will go through these slides with the startup and box by box ask them to explain things to me, just so that we are on the same page. We understand what both sides are talking about, and we cover all of the important areas. So the first investor meeting, let's see if we can, I'm still trying to click, there we go. In the first investor meeting, what are the metrics? What are the things that we will discuss? Well, we take the canvas. Laura, I think you're clicking. It doesn't look like my clicking's working. So we take the canvas, and next slide, we really look at the top of that canvas. That's the most important part. So if we're having the first meeting with the startup, this is what we're going to focus on. This is what we're going to mainly talk about. It's those 4 things. And we, after that, next slide, we will talk about the costs and revenues to understand, well, this model that you just described, does it make sense financially? How does the math add up? Okay, so next slide. And next click. As always, we start with the customer. That's the most important part. Click. Because really the bottom line is we need to understand what kind of business are you doing? Are you doing business to consumer, business to business, business to government? And click through to the next. And part of that is understanding, what region are you in? What age are the people, your customers? How much money are they making? Demographics, how many of these people are, and what market are they in? Is it Europe? Is it America? Is it South America? Is it Africa? What's the market? And then from there, we go to the next point. Once we have the data from this, I understand, okay, so these are the customers you're working with. Then I go to the value proposition. Next. And try to understand, okay, for this customer that you just described, what are their pains? What do they want solved? What are their gains? Can they make more money? Can they get more time? And they must be somehow getting by right now. So how much are they paying for their current service, whatever they're using to do their business right now? Then to understand what is the value, how much more value can you bring, and your total cost to produce that value. Then if this makes sense, the customer makes sense, the value you're providing the customer, you make sense, then we usually get into the discussion of, okay, let's talk about how you reach these customers. How is it that you have the relationship with these customers? How do you even find them? And more importantly, how will they find you? Next. And that's the little heart symbol on top. That's really where we talk about what are the channels. Are you finding these customers on LinkedIn? Are you finding them on Facebook? How much does it cost to find one of these people and get them to come to your site? And once they're on your site, how much will they buy? And how much will they buy over the next period? In other words, the lifetime value of this customer. Then we look at, okay, very interesting. Well, length of sales cycle, how long does it take to get these people aboard? And then how quickly can you grow this base to a scalable startup type of business model? Finally, if all of this makes sense, we go really to the delivery. And that's the the bottom box with the little truck right there. And if we click on that, then we talk about, okay, well, how long does it take for you to develop these services? How often do you have to release them, develop them, update them? How will the customers get their stuff? Is it all online? Is it through stores? Is it resellers? And how much each of these channels costs? Most people are quite surprised how much it costs to have a reseller in the loop. It's usually 50% is what the store, for example, or a warehouse or somebody else that sells your stuff will take. And of course, all of that is very important, including finally, well, you need to support these things. When people call the support line or ask for help or things broke down, that costs money as well. So these are all data points that we will discuss in the first meeting with the startup. Then we go on to the next slide, and then we will really discuss the bottom two boxes. That's the costs and revenues, and how much cost does it take to get this business model to work, and what is the potential revenue? How much are you making now and how much in the future? Next slide. Then we want to check, well, what have you done to test this hypothesis? Have you tried out different things, or is this the very first thing you're trying out? Often this involves sort of a discussion of, okay, this is what you've tried. Why did you start with this? Why did you think this is really the best way to begin? And then we look at also, well, what are the hypotheses we could test in the future to see if you can make even more money and expand this business model. So this is basically what we talked about also in Nairobi in the first session when we met in person. What we didn't get into is what we're going to talk about now. And that's really that in different business models, you're going to have to look at totally different metrics, because each business model will have its own specialized, specific data that we as investors will be interested in learning about. So SaaS is probably the number one most attractive for investors business model, because it's software as a service. You're creating essentially one piece of software and reselling it to everyone, and the cost is almost the same to provide to 10,000 people, to 100,000 people, 1 million people, once something is ready, once the platform is already made and operational. Examples of the SaaS you see there: Pipedrive, Zoom, Slack, MailChimp, Dropbox. All of these businesses, their business model is to create software and then to charge a monthly fee every month, forever, never ending, right? And that's very, very attractive for investors, because they're able to also say, oh, okay, so you charge $9.99 a month, you have this many customers, a year from now you'll have this many, multiply that by $9.99, and you can sort of predict what kind of revenues are coming down the line. That ability is very attractive, obviously, for investors. Marketplaces, which is the second type of business model, a little bit more complicated, because they involve really two sides. Every marketplace has two sides. eBay, Amazon, Airbnb, Etsy, all of these have two sides, and you need to have both sides working at the same time. For example, Airbnb. If you have a platform and you have a bunch of houses on there, but nobody wants to stay there, that will quickly devolve. That business model won't work. If you have Airbnb, but only people who want to rent, not enough houses, that will also fail after a while. So you have to have this balance of the houses and the people who want to rent them in order for the marketplace to work. The third example of hardware, probably the hardest, and vast majority of investors will not invest in hardware because it's very, very, very difficult to scale and has its own complications, as I will show you a little bit later with the data of why and how it's more complicated. Hardware, here it's, for example, Parrot. They make drones, Wallbox. They make batteries essentially for houses that can take electricity from solar panels or other sources, and then you can use it or sell it into the grid at the best time. Fitbits, maybe some of you even have on your hands Fitbits and GoPro cameras. Most of you have heard of them, or at least seen footage by GoPro cameras. These are very difficult businesses to build and grow because they do involve hardware, and hardware doesn't scale like software. You make one song and you can sell it to 1 million or 100 million people, and essentially your cost is the same, but you make one GoPro, one camera, and you just sell to one person. In order to sell to 1 million people, you need to make 1 million cameras, so your cost goes up dramatically compared to a song, for example, which is a digital good and can be easily replicated without major cost. So I will stop here for a moment to see we've basically caught up to where the Nairobi discussion took us. And this would also be the end, essentially, of the first meeting with investors. By the end of this meeting, I will understand as an investor, okay, you guys are doing a SaaS business for African small to medium enterprises, offering them an efficiency platform, calendaring, I don't know, invoicing, something else, and you charge approximately this much. By the end of this meeting, with that data and all the little boxes that you saw on the last slide, I have enough to decide, do we want to go forward with this? Does this fit us as the investor model? Because we also have a business model of who we invest in and how and why, and whether I should have a second meeting. Next, we will talk about that second meeting and the data that comes up. But I'll stop here for a moment. If people have questions about that first part, feel free. Now's the time. I don't know whether you have the little react button to where you can raise your hand, or whether you can just speak up. If you have a question, go ahead and ask that now.
Yes.
Yes.
Does this mean you do not invest in products or new products? You cannot eat. You cannot eat Dropbox. You cannot eat nothing.
Yes.
But all you need is you can use agriculture, for instance. You can use GoPros for yourself. Also, that is misunderstanding. So I think this ideas led to the problem in Germany at the moment. We have the car manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
They would also like to buy everything that is much cheaper. But on the long-term run, it will not work.
Very good question. This is what I was referring to as the difficulty of hardware startups. 95% of venture capital firms and angels, well, maybe 90% of angels and 95% of venture capital will not invest in hardware. Most will say it right on their website. Digital products, B2B, etc. Vast majority will not invest in hardware. There are a few hardware investors, and there are 1 or 2 hardware accelerators that will. They specialize in this area. They are very good at doing this, and they do it. Most of us, the rest, the 90% or 95%, don't go into that space because we regard it as too risky, too expensive, and too difficult, because we don't have the competence to succeed really in that area. So you need to seek out specifically hardware investors if that's what kind of a startup you're doing. All right, Laura, I think we'll just keep going then.
No, there's one more question.
Oh,
I'm
yep.
not the moderator, but I'm taking over as I'm German.
Great.
Chico,
Yeah.
go on, please.
Yes. So in regards to what you were speaking about with the focuses that software as a service should focus on, and how you were saying the experience, how do you tackle if they're new to that particular software, but they have prior experience in helping and building other softwares?
vast majority of startups will get into a space and an area that is new to them. And we accept that. It's not a problem. It's all about, like I said in the beginning, about the hypotheses. How much have you tested? Have you tried at least something in this area? Have you done a beta, soft release, even pilot customers, something like that? We take a look at what have you tested, what have you tried, and then what are your plans for additional testing and additional experiments. If it's very early, if you haven't tried anything, then it's usually we say, hey, too early for us. 99% of the time, probably VCs will say too early for us. And well, most startups are like, well, what do I do then? The answer is angels. Angel investors really fill usually this very early space. Angel investors are high net worth individuals. In America, it's like doctors and dentists, or people who've cashed out from startups before. They used to be CEOs, they sold their company, now they have extra cash. It's people with extra cash that can do like a 20,000, 50,000, 70,000 euro type investment. And ideally, that early angel also has experience in that thing that you're trying. They have some knowledge about that space, so they can not just give you money, but also help you because they've done something like that before. That is the most valuable kind of angel to have. And that's the step, sort of the ladder, the first three steps. First step is your money and your experiments. Second step is the angels helping you with a little bit more money and experience. And then the third step is the venture capital, in other words, professional investors, because we require more data usually, or more experimentation to see that you've at least released, you have some initial customers, initial traction with at least somebody, because that allows us to then call that somebody and say, hey, why are you using this? Why are you buying it? Why did you switch from the competitor to something new? And we begin to understand what's so special, what's so different about what you're doing. And if it is special and different, then venture capital is the right tool at that point. Okay, so basically the next step is a second investor meeting. To put it in perspective, Change Ventures looks at close to 1,000 deals a year and invests in 4 or 5. That's a very small percentage, yes. And that's true of the vast majority of startups and venture capital. Venture capital is usually saying no, because they're looking for a specific type of business model, specific type of business that fits their strategy. There are early stage, like pre-seed VCs. There are a little bit later stage, like Series Seed and Series A VCs. Then there are growth VCs, those that invest in Series B, C, D, and then there's private equity that comes after that, but that's already hundreds of millions. I don't get into that. Those are the big boys. Change Ventures is essentially a pre-seed seed type of fund. We look at fairly early on. Usually the companies will only have, I don't know, maybe 10,000 euros of revenue a month, but has some initial traction and initial customers that we can talk to understand why is it that they like what you're doing. So second investor meeting happens because the VC is interested in it. Usually the VC has decided that all of the data that you gave, all of the information, all of your pitch made sense to them, and they want to go on. So we do the second investor meeting, and in the second meeting, we now get a little bit more in depth into your specific business model, because each business model, as I described before, is different. And the next slide will show that for SaaS, software as a service, Pipedrive, They're from Estonia. I advised them with their first international business model. Fundraising, and with their business model, and looked at their landing pages, and we worked on that. But Pipedrive, just like Zoom, Dropbox, Slack, MailChimp, all use the SaaS model where you have a monthly charge. For that, if you click, then you see probably the most important data point that we begin to discuss at the second meeting is, okay, so what's your MRR? What's your monthly recurring revenue? That's what everybody wants to kind of get out of the way right in the beginning, to understand where you are in the progression. Are you in that pre-seed where the MRR is maybe 5,000, 10,000, 15,000? Are you in seed where it's 50,000, 60,000, 70,000? Or are you in Series A where it's like 100, 150 or more? That also tells us, like, is this our spot or not? If it's over 100,000, probably that's Series A level, and we as a fund wouldn't invest. If it's under 15,000, it's very early pre-seed, and we probably wouldn't invest. But somewhere in there, 15 to 100, that's where our fund invests. Other funds are stacked differently, and they have different strategies and rules. But that's what we begin with. The other data point that right away we want to understand is also your retention rate, because it's quite easy to quickly give away free product or other ways that you can maybe grow your revenue, but after people try it, they drop off right away. So there's very high churn, and you're not retaining the people that you're getting onto the platform. That shows us there might be a problem, that after the customer sees your product and tries it for 30 days, they leave. Therefore, there's going to be an issue probably. In order to understand then that customer's behavior, we look at monthly or daily, even active users. How many people a day are coming onto your platform, like Pipedrive, for example? How many people per day are using Pipedrive? And then how many people per month are using it? That gives us an understanding of how valuable is this piece of software for those customers. If they never use it, probably not valuable. They're probably not going to continue their subscription. And that's where the churn happens after the subscription isn't renewed. The two most important sort of headline data points for us, it's the customer acquisition cost and the lifetime value. And I will get into detail a little bit later when we do an exercise with you guys to understand how do you calculate these two things. But basically what CAC, or customer acquisition cost, means to us is, okay, how much does it cost for you to bring one person onto Pipedrive? Like, how much do you have to spend to get one customer to come and join you? And then the lifetime value is, well, once you bring that person in, how much is it worth over their lifetime before they churn out? If they stay for 12 months and pay $10 a month, well, then it's 12 times 10. That's their lifetime value. If they spend $100 a month for 12 months, well, that's a much higher lifetime value. Even at a lower monthly value, but if they stay for 3-4 years or 5 years, if they have major loyalty, well, then that is very good sign. They're happy with what you're providing, and therefore we would be happy also probably to invest. The secret, well, it's not secret, it's the everybody kind of as investors knows that the ratio of cost of acquisition to lifetime value should be at least 3 to 1. When I was talking to the Bolt guys in Nairobi, and when I talked to Martin here in Estonia for Bolt, you know, they're looking more like 6 to 1 lifetime value to cost of acquisition. Those are healthy numbers. That's a growing startup. That startup is making a lot of money off of the people that they're able to join. So they can also spend more money in getting new people to join because they understand that the lifetime value is higher. So these are the basic metrics that we will discuss in the second meeting with a startup that's doing a SaaS model. If you go to the next slide, then we have hardware. And that's a little bit different now because hardware behaves differently. And like I said, we don't do hardware as a fund, but there are a few funds in the world that do this. The reason why it's different is because of, I think, what one of you already alluded to in your question, and we see every day, because creating physical products is complicated and expensive. So there we want to see, well, what are the total sales revenues that currently you're making? And what's the cost to make those products, the cost of goods sold? Those are the data points that we begin to really dig down on to understand essentially what are the unit economics? How much does it cost to make one GoPro camera? We've invested into couple hardware startups. The reason why we invested in them is because they don't sell based on the traditional model of just selling the camera. For example, in Fund 1, we invested in a Latvian company that is making cameras for real estate agents. Giraffe 360 is the name of the company. But they don't sell you the camera. In fact, you cannot buy the camera from this company. You can only get it on a monthly subscription service. So every month you pay £200 because it's mainly in the UK, and that goes forever. The reason why that is a interesting business model for us is because it broke out of the problem of hardware sales. Otherwise, let's say you sell a GoPro, you get 300 euros for the GoPro. Well, that's it. One time you get 300 euros. Next month you get nothing. Month after that you get nothing. A year after that you get nothing. The reason why we liked this hardware company is because they switched out of that onto the basically a software type of service, the monthly fee. Because with regular hardware, it is very, very complicated to make continuous growth, continuous revenue growth, and money that is necessary for venture capital types of returns. For other types of investors, this might be okay. But for us, it wouldn't work, and we require the kind of month-to-month growth that only usually software can provide. The things to consider with hardware metrics, it is also vital to understand how often do these things break down, because people are going to want returns, want to do returns. In Europe, the law says that all technology can be returned for 2 years. Regardless of what warranty you provide, you can say, oh, 6 months, 1 year. The reality is the consumer protection laws in Europe say that you can return a digital device for 2 years if it's defective. Well, if half your cameras are coming back, that's going to be a huge problem for your business model, because you essentially have to buy them back. You have to give new ones. You have to pay for all that shipping, massive cost. Chances are you will make no money if you have that kind of failures. The other thing with hardware that's very difficult is that product life cycles, where they used to be, let's say 10 years ago, products would be a multi-year life cycle. In other words, a printer or even a phone, you wouldn't have a model every year. Now, every single phone, all the time, every year, there's a new phone. With a new phone, there's usually a new charger, and all of those pieces are constantly being renewed. So for hardware companies, it's not like you can do the hardware one time, boom, be done, and it's over. The reality is that for hardware companies, the moment you just released and sold this set of hardware, you already have to start planning, designing, procuring, buying, producing the next year's hardware. With hardware companies that supply components like screens, memory, the most that they will carry, most technology pieces and components, is 18 months. So even if you wanted to make the same camera 18 months from now, you probably will not find the pieces to make it, because like Yrjö and these other providers, they won't have those pieces, because those pieces have already been written off, and you need to design a brand new camera. So customer acquisition, still important. Lifetime value, still important, because that shows you the cost that it is to get people to come aboard and buy these things. And lifetime value, how many of these things they buy and what upgrades and add-ons do they buy. That's also, of course, relevant. But hardware, as you can see, very different things that you have to track and follow, and the data that you need to have on hand in order to explain why is it that your hardware company should get an investment. So next we have marketplace, also a very popular model. And we all know, the Airbnbs, the eBays, and all of that. There's, again, slightly different data that you have to follow, because you need to balance constantly the seller and buyer sides. And it costs you money to get sellers, and it costs you money to get buyers. So your cost of acquisition, two different sides of the model, you need to be tracking both of them. And you need to be tracking both the seller churn and the buyer churn. So it's almost double, really, the data that you have to have if the marketplace is your business model. Also very important for all the marketplaces are going to be things like time to purchase and time to delivery. For example, Amazon has started providing in major American cities, same-day delivery is standard now, pretty much. But in large cities like New York, you can get 1 hour delivery. In smaller cities, let's say Phoenix, you can get 4 hour delivery. So Amazon has gotten their time to purchase and time to delivery from the moment that you click to this thing being sent out. What you clicked, hey, I want toilet paper, click buy, to toilet paper being sent out, they've gotten it down to 6 minutes. So if you want to now compete on toilet paper or whatever of these everyday products that Amazon can deliver, you need to be able to get from that click to it being given to a shipper within 6 minutes. Very tough, very, very difficult, but you need to be tracking this all the time. There's an Estonian company, Yrjö. When I was in Nairobi, I'm actually an angel investor in it. They've been doing business in South Africa, and they just opened up their business in Kenya. And we were discussing exactly this. How is it that they can get their platforms, clothing delivery done quickly within days, not weeks or months? And it can be a real challenge to get those products out there. So marketplaces, again, different data, different focus. And the bottom line is that you need to grow both sides of the marketplace, and only if the sellers on your marketplace are successful do you make money, because the marketplace's business model is to take 5, 10, 20% of whatever's in the basket. So the gross merchandise value kind of determines how much money you can even make. Whatever's in their basket, you make 10% of, let's say, if that's your take rate. So that business model, quite a few VCs will invest in this, but you have to show that you're able to get both buyers and sellers onto the platform and get these deliveries out there quickly. So next slide. Okay, before I go on to do this quick exercise with you about your cost of acquisition, I will take another set of questions to make sure we don't leave anybody behind. If you have questions, feel free to ask now. And if you don't, we'll go on and Laura will click on the next one. All right, we'll keep going. Laura, if we can get the next slide. It's the cost of acquisition. And I'm curious, for those of you that already have their businesses going, what your cost of acquisition is. If you have a CAC number that you actually calculate, I'm curious what that is, because it can be dramatically different in different markets and for different businesses and for different business models. So I'd love to hear from you guys what what CAC you have calculated, if you have ever calculated CAC. Basically, if anybody in the meeting here has a cost of acquisition, if you have calculated a cost of acquisition for you, I would love to hear from you. If not, I'll just throw some numbers out there and ask you what you think is the cost of acquisition for like an average startup. Anybody? If you don't, it's okay. You guys might be very early on in your startups and businesses, which is fine. Even more, you're going to learn, I think, from yeah. Okay. So, what do you guys have for your cost of acquisition? Are there people here that have $20 per person cost of acquisition? Some might have 200. This is an area that really it can vary widely, and especially according to market. I'm curious to hear if you guys have any CAC calculations of your own.
Yrjö, there's just a quick chat from Francis. He says the exercise is quite complicated to access the cost of acquisition for a B2B SaaS platform. It's over 200.
Yeah. Well, what I wanted to point out is that a whole lot of startups will come to me and to my peers and other VCs and be like, okay, our cost of acquisition is 10 euros or $10 or $100. And the reality, if we look at just averages, this is the reality on the screen. To get one human being, one consumer from America, on average, $227 for one customer. I think that surprises a lot of startuppers because they're pitching 20, and it's an order of magnitude higher than they understand. For enterprises, the average is 7,430. Europe is about the same, maybe even higher, because in Europe, you don't have one currency. In Europe, you don't have one language. Even if you're selling to a homogeneous area like Scandinavia, you're going to have the Swedish crowns, the euro in Finland, the Danish crowns in Denmark, and Norwegian crowns in Norway. All of them have different languages. So actually, your costs are even going to be higher. So just so that you, when you go to talk to an investor, would have a concept of kind of what numbers they're used to hearing, then these are the numbers that really we have seen are the actual costs. Startups always underestimate these costs and dramatically reduce them in their pitches. And that, of course, makes it difficult for us to invest because we cannot trust the rest of the calculations. If you don't understand how much it costs for you to bring the next customer in, then every other number, regardless of what you're saying, oh, we have this much profit. Well, if you don't know how much it costs to bring in a customer, then we can't even talk about profit yet. And if you could click on the next slide, then what we have there is a calculation or showing you how to properly calculate the cost of acquisition. And I think the major mistake that companies make is that they forget that it isn't just the cost of clicks. Vast majority of startups that don't calculate the CAC properly are just including in the cost of acquisition, just, okay, here we go. They just do the advertising part. They say, okay, I spent 20 euros on Facebook ads, or I spent 100 euros on LinkedIn ads. I got this many customers, therefore that's my CAC. The reality is the cost of acquisition is much, much more than just the ad cost. It also, the customer acquisition costs includes the ads, yes, but also all your marketing costs. So if you have people out there that you pay to write one-pagers, articles, white papers, do various content marketing, SEO, all of that goes in there. You have employees probably that are at least one that's probably full-time dealing with marketing, advertising, running all those campaigns. Well, their cost goes in there. And finally, you probably have some kind of tools and tech as well. If you're making videos, if you're using Adobe, if you're using other technology, then that has a cost as well. And you add all of that up, and divide by customers, that's your true customer acquisition cost. I think this is where the problem comes from, because the vast majority of startups talk about only the cost of advertising, but that's only a small part of your total customer acquisition cost. It's usually much, much higher. And Laura, if you could go to the next slide, I will show you, yes, the dynamic sort of, first of all, if you compare different business models, e-commerce versus education versus entertainment versus fintech, you can see how the customer acquisition cost can vary, but then look also how it can vary depending on who your customer is. If your e-commerce customer is just a consumer, costs maybe $60 to bring them in. But if it's an enterprise, like I said, in the marketplace, you're going to probably have one side have the sellers, on the other side the consumers. It might cost you $2,000 to bring in that enterprise. And if you look at fintech, I see this all the time in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, to where fintech startups are like, oh yeah, I can bring in people $50 a person because they have a new neo bank or they have a virtual credit card or something like that. The reality is that in London, to get a fintech bank customer, just one consumer, usually it's £300 per person. And to bring in an enterprise, which in fintech would probably mean like a bank, this is a US number, 14,000. I think in Europe, it's more like 16 to 20,000 euros per enterprise, the cost of acquisition. It is very difficult to convince a bank to join a startup platform. Usually they're very conservative, they're afraid, they're not sure if your stuff will work, they're not sure if you are using proper governance, they're not sure what the rules are you using your anti-money laundering and all those measures. So it takes not days, not weeks, not even months, often takes years to get a bank to join, and that's how that cost gets to be that high. It's very high. So when we see a startup come in and be like, oh yeah, we can add people at $50 and add banks at $200, well, we know that's not accurate, and probably that conversation won't go much further, and the second meeting will be the last meeting as well. So it's important, I think, for startups to get these realistic numbers, and they're all available just by Googling, customer acquisition cost, fintech, bank, customer acquisition cost, fintech, consumer, and you can get up-to-date statistics, and you can see also how these things have changed over time, and the change is basically getting more and more expensive all the time to acquire these customers. Okay, so the lesson learned here: do your research, know what realistic numbers are out there, know also that each market is different. Like I said, United States maybe a little bit cheaper than Europe, because Europe has all these languages, all these regulatory barriers, all of these currency barriers, and same with Asia and same with Africa. You will have your own specialty issues which can really vary all of these numbers. Laura, if we can go to the next one. Okay, lifetime value. The important part for people to understand about lifetime value is that if you can make the customer stay for a long time, it can be really valuable, and therefore you can also spend a lot. The reason why I said people are willing to spend, £300 to get one banking customer in London is because their lifetime value is usually 3 times higher. So to put it, very simply here, I use the coffee example. If you are a coffee shop and you're thinking, okay, one person comes in the morning before going to work and buys a coffee, that's $5. Great. How much would I pay to get that customer? $5, $50, $500. And initially it might seem insane, totally crazy to bring in a person at 50 or 500 when the cup of coffee costs $5. But if you believe, and your testing shows, that person, after tasting your coffee, will keep coming back again and again. They'll come back every morning before going to work. So you take 200 days of work, multiply that by $5, and if that person stays with you just 1 year, that's $1,000 of lifetime value. So if somebody says, yeah, I'll bring you these customers at $50 per person, and their lifetime value is $1,000, well, that's a good deal. It makes sense. Of course, you have to be fairly confident that their lifetime value really is that high. Otherwise, maybe you lose the $50 or at least 45 of the $50 after they have their 1 cup. So this is, again, why it's so important to be calculating, keeping track of this data, that if you understand your actual lifetime value of your customers, you will understand how much you can spend to bring these people in without going broke, and how you can make a very profitable business model if the lifetime value of these people is high. I remember one of the numbers I ran across in gaming, online games, World of Warcraft was charging people $29 a month to play World of Warcraft. But turns out that people were extremely loyal. Once these people came aboard and started playing this game, most of them stayed for over 3 years. So take that $30 a month, times 12, times 3. So value of every one of those World of Warcraft players is thousands and thousands of dollars. So you could spend quite a bit to do advertising to bring in people into your game if you know your game is able to keep them online, keep them playing, and keep them satisfied. Very, very profitable business. Other games, Zynga, for example, found out very quickly that their lifetime value was very, very low. They were spending massive amounts of money to bring people in. Mafia Wars was a game. Farmville was a game. People came on initially, oh, very cool, played a couple days, maybe a month, churned out, lifetime value very low. And in fact, they were paying more for people to come in than they were earning off of these people because they churned out after a month. So literally they were paying people to play, not the other way around. That's not really a business if you're paying other people to use your service and you can't get that turned around. So that's the importance of lifetime value. And Laura, if we go to the next slide, that's where the LTV CAC ratio, we'd like to see 3 to 1. Like I mentioned, Bolt and successful companies have 5 to 1, 6 to 1 lifetime values to cost of acquisition. It's very, very difficult to make a business work if you don't have those ratios in place. If it costs you more to bring on new customers than they actually produce for you, you can put it into an Excel table and you can literally see on the table where your bankruptcy will be, because you're constantly spending more than is coming in. And that's not a business model that an investor is going to be very interested in. Okay, next slide. I wanted to also do another exercise with you, because this is another sort of failure mode with a lot of startups, is not understanding how leads convert into paying customers. Next slide. And this is a typical type of funnel that a startup would be tracking. They'll do Google ads. They'll say, okay, we'll do 100,000 ads on Google. So that's 1,000 CPM. We know how much Google ads cost. We know pay-per-click is on average about $2.69, meaning on the search results, you'll show up. If it's a paid ad, one click that people put on there, boom, Google just made $2.69 off of you, okay? And a lot of people, a lot of startups, I would say more than half the startups don't have this funnel right. Most of the startups vastly overestimate the number of customers they would get from such a campaign. So 100,000 initial views, how much would it mean in clicks? Go ahead, Laura. The reality is that click-through rate is 3%. So if you have 100,000 people coming in, you only get 3,000 people who clicked on it. And of the 3,000, bounce rate 50%. 3,000 people click. 50% of those people go, oh yeah, this isn't for me. I'm not interested. And they leave your website right away. And the average conversion rate, CVR, is 3%. So once you get 100,000 people campaign going, it probably means that 100,000 people saw it, 3,000 clicked, 1,500 bounced right away from your website and said, I'm not interested in this. I don't care. I don't want to buy. This is not for me. And only 45 people out of the 100,000 that saw it will convert to do the thing that you wanted. Technically, this doesn't yet mean that they buy. For a lot of startups, this conversion, that taking action, means usually signing up, giving their name or giving their phone number or giving their address. They haven't bought yet. But this shows you how difficult, actually, if you don't follow this funnel, you're thinking, oh, we're spending a bunch of money on Google Ads. I'm sure we're going to have a bunch of sales. Well, you're going to need at least 100,000 people to look at it before you get 45 sales. This is over half the startups make this mistake. They dramatically overestimate the number of people they can get from ads. And referrals, only 2% or so for e-commerce will refer their friends. So if 100,000 people saw it, at the bottom of the funnel, you have 0.9 customers added from referrals. It's those 45 people, 2%. So you get one referral. Now, the way startups start working with this is trying to improve each of these layers. How do we make our ad more attractive so that of the 100,000 people, more than 3,000 will click on it? What are the words we have to use that get people to click on it more? And that's all about data. That's all about statistics. If we use this word, and there's software available that will tell you. If we use the word new versus updated, what does that mean? How many people will click? If we use the word, I don't know, attractive versus spectacular, how many clicks more are we going to get? So literally every single word in your ad, you can see the statistics online, even live. How much would it mean we'd get more people to click on the ad? And that layer by layer like that, using the data, you begin to improve your funnel. And instead of 45, you might have 100, 200 people taking action at the bottom. And instead of one referral, you might have 10, 15 referrals. You can double, triple, or go up an order of magnitude in the effectiveness of your lead funnel if you're paying attention to each of these layers and taking action one at a time to improve each one. You figure out, why are people bouncing from our website? Can we make it more attractive? Can we make it clearer? Do we need video? Do we need to simplify it? Usually the answer is simplify. Have less stuff, have less words, have less distraction. How do we get that conversion rate up? Usually it means one button, 3 choices, not hundreds of choices, not all kinds of buttons everywhere. And how do we improve referral? Can we already pre-write referrals? Can we make a simple referral button right away for these customers? And layer by layer by layer, a startup can really improve this conversion funnel. This is the discussion that we usually have with the startup going through their funnel and say, okay, describe your funnel to us. Top of the funnel, middle of the funnel, bottom of the funnel. What have you done? What are you doing? What is the data that shows us that you have a good funnel? That by putting in, so many coins up on top brings out 3 times more coins on the bottom of the funnel. That's the discussion we have, second and third meeting usually with the startup. Once we have this one funnel, then we will ask you, well, what else did you try? What other hypotheses have you tried? Have you seen that maybe LinkedIn is more effective? The click-through rates, the bounce rates, the CVR rates I showed you there, those are averages for Google and for e-commerce. Each of these is different for every business model. Each of these is different for every continent, for every country. They vary slightly, but they're basically the same. But there's big differences between Google, LinkedIn, Facebook, TikTok, and we will try to go through this with you and be like, okay, let's compare if you put in 1,000 euros into Google ads versus if you put in 1,000 euros into LinkedIn ads. How many customers and how many referrals will you end up with? If you haven't done this kind of a comparison, if you haven't even thought about this, or at least don't have a plan, a hypothesis for doing this, you're probably too early for venture capital. We, as investors, we would like to see you have at least experimented, even with $100 in Google and $100 in LinkedIn, and then compared these two funnels. With $200, you can have an experiment and show that you as a startup understand how to do this funnel. And if I give you 200,000, 500,000, €1 million with my investment, that it isn't going to just burn, right? That it actually is going into you doing this just on a better, faster, larger scale. We as investors, we're not just giving you money to play with, right? We are giving you money because we believe you will use it wisely. This is how you show that you will use it wisely, that you have a hypothesis, you have a plan, and you've tried it at least once. So it's believable for us that if we put in money, you will know how to do this again and more efficiently, okay? I wanted to go also through some top mistakes that I keep seeing with startups when they pitch. At this second or third, usually second or third is when everything I've been talking about happens in the second or third meeting. The first meeting is over coffee, it's 45 minutes. The second meeting might be over lunch or in the office, it's an hour, hour and a half. Third meeting is usually 2 to 3 hours at the VC's office, and usually there will be more than one person from the VC in the meeting. In the second and third meetings, these are the mistakes that we continue to see half the time. Half the startups from the Baltics do this at least. When we're talking about metrics, the startups mix up bookings and revenue. They always mix it up the same way. They present revenue numbers when they're really meaning bookings, not the other way around, almost never the other way around. Startups will be like, oh, we're making $12,000 in revenue. Well, no. Are you making bookings 12,000 or are you making revenue 12,000? If you make a 1-year contract for $12,000, that means you booked 12,000. They haven't paid it yet. You haven't given the services yet. You have a piece of paper, a contract, an agreement for 12,000. But many things can still happen between them agreeing to pay you 12,000 and you actually ending up with the money on your bank account. And that's the difference between bookings versus revenue. Bookings is just a promise, a commitment And revenue is actual money coming in onto your bank account. So that 1 year, 12,000 contract means 1,000 of MRR, of actual revenue that month. Okay, so that's a typical mistake. Startups, of course, want to sound more successful. They want to sound like they have more revenues. And so they talk about everything they've closed on a piece of paper. The reality is some of these pieces of paper are worthless. These customers disappear, or the customers quit after 1 month, or the customers don't pay and they end up owing you. So you have receivables. So just because they promised and said maybe they will or they might doesn't mean that you've created revenue. You've created bookings. So for us, that's, again, it shows that probably the CEO isn't too familiar with financing and is using terms loosely, or maybe they're not understanding the difference between recognizing revenue and just bookings. Okay, so that's sort of mistake number one. Mistake number two is the next slide. That's GMV and revenue. Again, comes, I think, from the same thing. Rarely is the startup actually trying to cheat us. Very, very rarely. It's like 2% of all the startups we see are trying to actively lie to us or cheat us. They want to be positive. They want to show they're doing well. So a lot of the time, we ask them, okay, so what are your revenues? And they'll give us a number. Oh, our revenues this year are 1 million. Well, is it really revenues, or is that the GMV, the gross merchandise value? What's the difference? The difference is that, let's say they're a marketplace and people have sold $1 million worth of stuff on their marketplace. Is $1 million their revenue? No, that's the gross value of all the merchandise sold on the platform. So their sellers made $1 million, not the startup. The startup made whatever is their take rate. For example, if the take rate is 20%, or Apple takes 30%, for example, of everything sold through them. I think Facebook Marketplace takes 20, I'm not sure, but something like that. Let's say 20% is your take rate, then your revenue is 200,000. It's your take rate from everything that was sold on your site. So you can't mix these two. They're two very, very different things. Again, I think the startup is just trying to show, oh, we have a lot of volume, everything, there's a lot of money going through our platform, and that's fine. It's okay to talk about that, but just using the right terminology, because if you say 1 million was your revenue, then that means, you were doing 20 million in GMV. And there's a big difference between 20 million in GMV and 1 million in GMV. So using the right terminology, again, very important here. Revenues are not the same as the value of the money going through your platform. Another mistake we see regularly is recurring revenue versus total revenue. I think this partly comes also from all of these grants that a lot of European companies are getting, various local government grants, state grants, as well as EU grants. And of course, again, the startup wants to show that they're making money and they're doing well, and they'll often add in the state grants as part of their revenue because it's money coming in. So they're like, oh, it actually came in this month. We divided it by 12, so per month, here's the revenue. But the reality is that the state grants or one-time fees, for example, if you're doing software for enterprises, you have a monthly fee of 100 euros, but a setup fee of 2,000. Well, the setup fee isn't your recurring fee because it doesn't recur every month. Recurring revenue is that which is all the time recurring. If the setup fee is a one-off and it's a one-time thing, well, then it's part of your total revenue, not recurring revenue. Okay? So the mistake we run into, again, the startup is trying to show that they're doing really well, they're successful, and they'll talk about their recurring revenue, but they're adding in there all kinds of one-off payments, which really will not recur again and again and again every month. And that throws off the number. And then we have to do our own calculation, like, okay, well, you say you made this much revenue, but really you made this much. And then you begin to question all the other numbers. And it starts this uncomfortable cycle where you're trying to build trust. But if you're using these wrong numbers, we don't assume you're lying. We just think that, oh, okay, maybe they don't understand, or maybe they got it wrong. All of that means, the trust crumbles a little bit. And for us, we're thinking, okay, well, maybe this CEO or this person isn't very good with finances. Well, that isn't really the message you want to send when asking for $1 million, is that you're not good with finances. Because most people don't want to transfer $1 million to someone who doesn't understand the basic differences in financing, like recurring versus total revenue. So I emphasize recurring means recurring, meaning it happens regularly all the time, month to month, over and over. It's not a one-off peak. Hey, these guys paid us a massive upfront fee, which will never happen again, and then they pay us monthly. That massive one-off isn't your recurring revenue. It isn't what you're going to continue to have forever, every month after that. So it misrepresents essentially your business model if you use that metric. Okay, and then we have the final, I think, mistake, chasing vanity metrics. What do we mean by vanity metrics? Well, one of your metrics will probably be better than the others. For some people, it's the month-to-month growth. For other startups, it might be GMV. For other startups, it might be the low churn. Then often the startup falls in love with this one metric. They're like, oh, look at this number. And suddenly the entire company begins to focus on that number because they're doing really well in that one number. But as a business, this doesn't necessarily mean it's a successful business that you have one number correct. Just like flying a plane, because you have one number correct doesn't mean that you're not going to fly into a mountain. You really need to have the speed and the altitude and other things correct in order to continue to fly and fly successfully. The same way in startups, just because this one number looks really good, you can't just put all your efforts into that one number and continue to only talk about that one number and focus all your money and all your staff and everybody like maximizing that one number. That's vanity. That's falling in love with one metric. It's really a combination of several things, right? Even the LTV and CAC, you need the LTV, you need the CAC. You also can't have the churn. It's a multiple data pie, really, that you have to have a successful business. And that's what we're analyzing in that meeting 2 and meeting 3, because by meeting 4 with the startup, we're probably already looking at drafting a term sheet. A term sheet is a 2-page document, essentially, that us as investors will prepare, saying, hey, we are interested in your startup. We're willing to put in 500,000, 700,000, $1 million into your startup at this kind of valuation. You have 30 days to decide. So if you get to that piece of paper, you're probably going to get the money. We have never, in our entire Fund 1, Fund 2 history, 10 years, we have never not followed through on a term sheet. We have always invested if we have issued a term sheet. It's something very dramatic, something really bad has to happen to not go from the term sheet to the investment. In order to get to that term sheet, we look at all of these metrics, we look at all this data, and we do the customer interviews to confirm that this data is backed up by real life examples, by real life customers. And that's how us as a VC, and I've talked to all my peers, we are very representative. I would say 90 99% of the VCs I know use this same model. So essentially, these slides will tell you exactly what you need to have in order to raise financing. This gives you vast majority of the answers for a bunch of different business models. So I'm happy to take questions. We've gone 1 hour and 20 minutes so far. We planned for 1 hour and 30. Any specific questions about your startups, your ideas, your investors, anything like that, I'm completely open. I'm yours for as long as you have questions.
We have Jorge.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering what was your experience with fintech-related startups, and which are the most common points you focus on during your meetings with these startups? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. We have done quite a few fintech investments. One of the investments was in Africa, and it was super successful. Like, I think to this day, it makes 3 million a month in revenue. But because we didn't know enough about the business they were doing, there was a problem. Okay. The name of the startup is Planet 42. And what happened was, yes, what is their business? Their business is essentially short-term car rentals and on a rent-to-own basis. So that a middle-class person that cannot get financing for their car can pay essentially week, month at a time, and instead of it just poof disappearing, right? That money, if they continue to pay, that money accumulates, and one day that car is actually theirs. They own it, right? Which is great in the markets that don't have good financing. So they were operating in South Africa and Mexico, and it was working very well as a business model until the returns started. The returns started higher than expected in the business model. I think the business model expected something like 1% or something of defaults and returns to where people can't pay, and they're just like, here's your car, sorry. And suddenly, when I think the government changed in South Africa, the rand fell, so the currency was different, all of those things happening at the same time, suddenly, you know, the returns went up from 1 to 3% or something like that. Well, it doesn't sound like much, but it's like a 200% increase in returns. So your write-offs and costs, when a car comes back, you got to repair that car, you got to clean it up, you got to put it up for sale, you got to recycle it, do all these things. There's all kinds of costs involved in that. And if you don't calculate those correctly, and then you add to that the difference in your currency, it can be a dramatically different business model, the way it looks, you know, on finances. So, you know, we learned that doing just the regular, lifetime value, which is obviously very important, cost of acquisition, really important. We didn't take into account enough the cost of basically returns, support, currency risks, things like that. Within fintech, there are different models as well, right? If you're trying to do a neobank, or you're trying to do, I don't know, an AML platform, so all of those will have their own issues as well, all of that specific data that you need to look at. But I think overall, the biggest mistake and the thing that that we learned from that and other fintechs is to not underestimate the expenses related to running the platform. The idea in fintech a lot of the time is, oh, it's very thin, it's really cheap, we don't need all those things that banks need. Well, the reality is that fintechs, the moment they take in other people's money, they become fiduciary responsible under the law for that money. So that, yes, you do need, a lawyer, at least part-time. You're going to need someone who looks over all your contracts, make sure these are correct. You will need to make sure that every payment is correct down to the cent, to the last cent, which means the entire platform needs to be built in such a way that it guarantees all of the payments correctly, taking into account all of the changes in currencies, all of the transaction fees, everything. Even if you're losing 1 cent per transaction, you're probably violating some kind of a law related to fintech providers. I think in the startup world, people assume that, oh, but it's a startup. People say, hey, move fast, break things, try things out, boop, 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 the Wild West. Well, the moment you take other people's money, it's not the Wild West. You have to guard it almost like a bank. And I think the vast majority of startups underestimate the cost of doing that in terms of accounting, in terms of lawyers, in terms of even development, because setting up the proper accounting and structures on the back end of your development side is also much more expensive if you do it right, if you do it properly, if you hold the data in the right place, because you can quite easily violate various data practice laws now that you have people's delicate financial data. Do you have to keep it in Europe? Do you have to keep it in Asia? Do you have to keep it in all those places for each of those customers, depending on whether it's a European customer, depending on if it's an African customer, depending if it's an Asian customer? To do all those things right, the cost is usually higher. That's something we learned with investing into different startups, that upfront it looks like a no-brainer, really easy. We're doing it very thin, that you can just do a fintech, really, 3 people and a bank account. The reality is, no, you're underestimating your back end, your overheads cost by 20 to 30%.
Hi, we have
Thank you very much.
We have a question in the chat as well. What are the critical ecosystem characteristics you like to see before you fund someone, for instance, in Kenya?
Yeah. One of the issues that VCs have, venture capital, the moment I take in other people's money, when I take like the Finnish pension fund's money and invest it, I have to account for it now all the time. I have that fiduciary responsibility. I have to make sure that I can give that money back. And investing in countries where I don't understand the laws, or the laws are very different, or the taxes aren't paid, or the proper governance measures aren't in place, I probably can't invest. I probably cannot show my investors that I'm being careful with their money. If the country doesn't have the right legal system for recovering money, for minority shareholder rights, because we only, in exchange for our investment, we'll usually take 15% maybe of your shares. So we're a minority investor. The owners, you guys, the founders, will still have probably 70%, right? You might have option pool, you might have some other investors, but we're always going to be a minority shareholder. If my rights are not protected, if I don't have access to legal documents, if I don't have access to the courts, it's going to be almost impossible for me to invest, because I cannot explain to the people who gave me money that I can safeguard their money. And if things go wrong, I can resort to legal help. So a lot of the time, in order to make an investment, venture capitalists will say, okay, and it's not about Kenya. It's same way with South Africa, for example, or we had investments for Mexico. For all of these countries, essentially, other than UK, Netherlands, and United States, other than those countries, usually the investors will be like, okay, let's set up a company in one of those primary countries. Let's set up an Irish company, let's set up a UK company, or let's set up an American Delaware corporation, and we'll invest into that. That will be the parent company that will own 100% of the Kenyan company or whatever's the startup. All of the intellectual property, all of the rights, all of the revenues, everything ends up going into that Delaware corporation or the UK limited company. Then the investor knows that if there's a problem, they can go to a Delaware court or court in London. They can use their lawyers who speak English, who can file documents, who know the law. It's more predictable. That is usually a step that's required for any country where the VC doesn't feel comfortable, that the minority rights, taxes, legal, all those issues are fully governed. So we can basically invest as VCs anywhere as long as we take these proper precautions. But going into, for example, I mean, look at Russia. If you go and invest into Russia today, it can be very, very risky. I mean, large companies like IKEA, large companies, oil companies even lose their money. These are billion-dollar companies who end up losing their stores, end up losing their money, not because they did anything wrong, but because of the political risk or the legal risk involved. So investors don't want to take that legal risk or political risk. So they try to set up some kind of a structure where it's possible to make the investment by reducing the risk. And that structure usually is a parent company in one of the recognized legal hubs like America or UK. A lot of companies in Estonia have to do this as well, because even though we've had 10 unicorns, and even though Bolt was able to keep their headquarters here and their legal structure here, quite a few of the Estonian companies still had to do UK or a US structure in order to get foreign investment.
Well,
any other questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Yrjö, for a wonderful presentation, and thank you for the questions. I see that we have gone a little bit over time, and thank you for your patience also. And
I'm happy. And on the last slide is my email. You guys can contact me there. All of you that are interested in getting your copy of these slides, I have sent them to Laura. So if you contact Laura at SDev, they are handling all this. We are happy to work with SDev and work with Kenyan and other African startups to help you guys. There's no sense in reinventing the wheel. In Estonia, we have gone from zero, from a post-Soviet nothing, to having 10 unicorns in 30 years. It's possible to go from just dirt poor with nothing happening to quite successful ecosystem. But a lot of these things have already been figured out. A lot of the documents and things, we're happy to help you guys. Contact Laura, you get the slides, and hopefully, we can work with you in the future.
Thank you again for everyone. Thank you, Yrjö. And I will send the slides to this chat as it was suggested. I hope you enjoyed our webinar, and do please give us feedback in the survey. Survey is also brought in the chat. So thank you, and we'll finish the meeting now. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.